The previous video introduced a number of core concepts about digital land registration. We're going to formalize these in a little bit more detail here. So rights. So in terms of the land register, rights describe the things or registrable rights defined by land that are held by parties. So again, we have this parties, rights and land relationship, a theme that you'll see as building on throughout these presentations. And rights are part of this social contract between society and the register. As again we described in one of the earlier videos, that land registration is all about that kind of social framework. And so within society you have this kind of amorphous set of all rights. These are all kind of the possible things, and people may not even know about them. But as soon as people start to talk and conceptualize them, it kind of moves into this set of named rights because they're given a name. And if they start to become quite important or of increasing relevance to society, they can come enshrined in legislation. They become part of a set of legal rights. And then over time, they become so important that they're part of the land registration process. So they become part of a set of registrable rights associated with the land register. And so you have this kind of amorphous nature that some of these rights can change over time. And that reflects the need of the legislation to keep in step with social change and the social expectations within which it operates. There are two main categories of registrable right. There is an ownership right, the primary right, and non-ownership or subordinate right. There is also this concept called the principal land. In Scotland it's called the solum, in England it's called freehold, but essentially it's this element that is the concept that conveys what land in its initial instance is. So our principal land here is defined by a polygon on the surface of the earth, and by owning the principal land you actually conceptually convey a three-dimensional ownership, and that goes from the center of the earth, inscribing an arc through the nodes that represent your polygon and going up into the sky. Now in Scotland it goes conceptually all the way up to the heavens. In England their aspirations are not quite so high and it stops at the sky. But you're seeing there that this surface which is draped over the surface of the earth, the principal land, actually conveys the whole three-dimensional nature of ownership. But also, as a concept, the principal land is essentially a bag of rights. So all of that kind of set of amorphous, unknown rights are in many respects conveyed within that principal land concept. Now, some of the rights that are in there can be legally separated. Now, the separation of some of those rights is actually undertaken by statute or the Crown in the first instance. So if you remember from our first video where we described how the Crown grants land, the initial granting of land from the Crown would would have reserved some elements such as gold and silver or salmon fishing. And so as much as the king, and it mainly was a king, would have granted land out, he's going, yes, you can have this land, but you're not going to have the gold and silver rights that underpin it, and you're not going to be able to fish in there because I reserve a right to go and fish in there. And over time, those things are formalized into legal statutes, and now it's not a crown issue, it is now a legislation issue. So in many countries, gold, silver, oil, coal, mineral rights are removed by statute from land which is owned privately. But beyond legal separation of rights, you can have separation using conventional tools, i.e. legal instruments, using your solicitor or notary during a conveyancing process. And from those you can separate out ownership rights or non-ownership rights. So in Scotland these are called separate tenements, this separation of rights done from the principal land, and it's a useful term, so I'll carry on using it. So you can conventionally separate out strata and minerals, for example, and strata is very important because that's how you can start to define flats and flatted buildings. Or for the non-ownership rights, you can pull out things like lease or security or life rents, burdens, servitudes, and easements. And it's using these tools where you can start to give for example, say rights of access over your neighbour's land. So if your neighbour's land is between you and the nearest road, then you would need a right of access over their land to drive your car from the road to your property. And that is secured using a non-ownership easement or servitude over that land. Parties. So in terms of the land register, parties describe the things that can hold registrable rights defined by land. LADM uses parties a lot, and it's not just about those who are right holders, it's about any party who engages in that kind of transactional process to do with land management. So in terms of registrable right holding parties, there are a number of types. You can have a natural party, you can have an unnatural party, you can have a trust, joint ownership, so that's a collection of parties, but the key thing about a trust is it acts as a single group, not as individual entities. And a cadastral unit can have rights in other land. We saw that in terms of the rights of access. So a cadastral unit can have rights of access over another cadastral unit. Now, actually, it doesn't mean to say that that land can go over someone else's land, because that's impossible. But what the cadastral unit is doing there is acting as a proxy for the people who actually own that cadastral unit itself. And so it becomes a mechanism to make the conveyancing process more efficient. And so these registrable parties have rights in the fact that they own land or they benefit from rights over someone else's land. But then when you have an owning party, your owning party can have these rights in one of two different ways, which is an exclusive ownership, i.e. an individual party or party group owns 100% of the ownership, or in common, i.e. they can have multiple parties coming together collectively, each of which owns a share of the property and each of which can divest their share in their own terms. So in this instance, we have 1/5, 2/5, 1/5, and 1/5 going to a natural party, an unnatural party, a trust, and a cadastral unit. Um, um, and say, for example, the natural party might want to sell at any point of time. They have the freedom to do that. So that is a common ownership. We won't go into trusts because it's not really that interesting. And then there's land. Land is a thing that has a spatial extent. That describes the extent of a right, and it's held by parties. So it's essentially the spatial extent of the thing we're interested in. Applications. You get applications that go to the register, and they have the following purpose. They're a vehicle for registering a legal instrument, normally a deed, within the land register, and they hold supporting transactional metadata. There'll be stuff about dates, there'll be stuff about the applicant, there might even be stuff about the how much was offered for the property. And these tend to be defined by what's in the local jurisdiction. Then there are legal instruments, and these again are jurisdiction dependent and used to legally instruct registrars to make changes to the register, and that's normally through a deed or contract. So the legal instrument itself describes specific rights relationships between a granting party, normally the owner, and a grantee party, the benefitor, over an area of land. It can be used to describe multiple rights granted to multiple parties over multiple areas of the land. So as long as the grantor owns the land, and by extension has the right in that big bundle of rights that we talked about earlier, they can grant any of those things to a third party. If a legal instrument is invalid, then the legal instrument is rejected. If it's valid, i.e. you can't find any invalidity in it, then it must be registered. But not necessarily all the rights in a legal instrument are registrable. Legal instruments themselves can be thought of as APIs. Now, APIs are a programming element which define the relationships between a system and its back end. And APIs define change, something that creates, varies, or discharges, erases something, and it's designed to change in a thing. So that thing is of interest to the parties and of its interest to the registration body. So in our instance, it's a registrable spatial right, and it's legal, so it's executed, witnessed, and delivered. The legal instrument itself may have a whole range of other elements associated with it. So some of the rights in a legal instrument are registrable. It normally involves land. Land is normally, but not exclusively, described spatially. We'll talk about that later on. Some of those reservable rights are incorporated into the cadastral map, or it could be done in more flexible ways. And again, this comes into jurisdiction dependent change, and this is where we might get into issues of, deriving title and registering title, and we'll talk about those later on as well. Some jurisdictions also provide wriggle room to take into account off-register rights, and these are called overriding interests. And this can cause problems for things like torrents. And again, we will discuss a bit more of that later, but at the moment, we're just describing the general framework of registration. And then what we're going to talk about primarily in the first instance is a deed registration system. And a deed registration system means that the deed, the legal instrument itself, is registered. And a deed is evidence that a particular legal transaction took place. But you've already heard me say it. I've talked about titles. Everyone talks about registering title, not about registering deeds. So what is a title? Once again, we'll go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia page on title states that the following. In property law, a title is a bundle of rights in a piece of property in which a party may own either legal interest or equitable interest. These are things that we've discussed in our previous slides, so that's all quite comfortable. And these rights in the bundle may be separated and held by different parties. Again, these are things that we've introduced in our previous slides, so that all makes sense. So a title is the resolved legal implication of a register of deeds for a specific piece of owned land, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But we've also talked about chain of title already, so doesn't that demonstrate indefeasible ownership? Because we did that in the first set of slides. And it does. So we have a bit of a problem here that linguistically the word title is overloaded and it can mean different things in different contexts. So we should be aware that title can mean the following. It can be a chain of title demonstrating indefeasible ownership, i.e. I clearly own this, I can demonstrate chain of ownership from the original grant. And it can also represent the articulation, either derivation as it were, of all the beneficial and encumbering rights associated with owned land. So why would you derive title? Well, as a buyer, i.e. a grantee, you want to understand whether the seller actually owns the land, that chain of title concept that we talked about earlier on. But you also want to find out what beneficial rights you might get by owning that land. This land might not be connected to a road. Do you get a right of access through your neighbour's land to actually get to the road? That's useful to know. But also what beneficial rights third parties have over the land that you own. Does somebody else have a right of access over your land? Those things become restrictions or responsibilities that you as a landowner, have to make sure that you deliver. So determine this rights, restrictions and responsibilities associated with a piece of owned land. Your solicitor looks at all of the deeds that affect or are affected by the owned land, and then the legal implications are resolved to produce your title deed or your chain of title. Now, this is trivial in a well-structured digital system, but it can be quite difficult in paper-based systems. And that's why the torrents title, or registration of title, was introduced in South Australia in 1858. But we'll talk about that in more detail a little later on. So we've gone around that kind of bigger concept of title, but what about the more pragmatic in terms of some of the land registrars? Well, Registers of Scotland and Her Majesty's Land Registry define a title in similar ways. So a title sheet defines the extent of a plot of land on a map and gives details of current owners, price, mortgage details and conditions affecting the property. I have a slightly different version, which aligns with this as a digital registration and rights-driven process. So a title defines the principal beneficial ownership right, the main plot, other beneficial rights by dint of ownership, i.e. any non-ownership rights and any ownership rights. This set of ownership rights, the main plot, and any beneficial ownership defines what we will call the subjects. And then any non-ownership rights that affect the owned land, i.e. rights that are shared with third parties, that become responsibilities, and rights that are exclusively held by third parties, which become restrictions, and then any other metadata. So essentially it's saying the same thing. I'm just reframing the concepts in terms of data and data relationships. And so let's go through this. Here we have a Napoleonic Cadastral Map, and it's for the area called Le Grand Prix 1019, which is just here. So we have the principal owner, the main plot, and this is Monsieur Noir in 1019. Here we are, and that is the spatial extent of that ownership right. And so what benefits do you get by owning that land? So that's rights held by the cadastral unit. In this instance, there is a right of access to the bridges. Here we are, and that's over here, and that's described by that spatial extent there. And what encumbrances, i.e. what rights are held by third parties over the owned land. And this could be securities, i.e. mortgages or other non-ownership rights. And in this instance, there is a right of access and fishing rights over this area here to Monsieur Bonaparte. Looks like he's got a right of access and fishing rights to a road at the minute. I thought it was a canal, I think, when I first digitized this. So titles here are derived by rights cross-referencing. So rights cross-referencing is structured through spatial interaction between the ownership extent, the cadastral unit, and the deed extent, and party relationships where the cadastral unit is a benefiting party referenced in a deed. This cross-referencing is automated and does not require materializing a title sheet, i.e. if you have a register of deeds, you can materialize all of these rights dynamically. Okay, we'll go more into some of the conceptual registration theory in the next video.